Ko māteni toko ingoa no hane kareaho no kanata hoki ki Aotearoa ka noho au ki te whanganuiatara me o te pōti. Kia ora. Wo jiao ma ding. Wo tong Zinzilan lai. Hi everybody. My name is Martin Fisher. I am a lecturer in the Ngāi Tahu Research Center, and I'm going to discuss I think a really interesting topic that hasn't been looked at very much, which is looking at the different sort of government policies and relations between the Crown, the New Zealand government, and Maori here in New Zealand, and then Chinese states' relations with ethnic minorities in China. So this is what I'm going to go through, and it's very exploratory. This is something that I've just started looking at this year. So feel free to ask any questions or shout out if there's something that you know that's wrong. But this is just a very preliminary look. And I wanted to look at this because it's so often used that we're stuck in the paradigm of just looking at Anglo-settler states. We're just looking at Australia, Canada, the United States, and New Zealand and comparing these experiences. And I think this much more global view of what's happening is helpful for countries and the people within the countries, especially Maori and ethnic minorities there. So this was kind of the purpose behind looking into this topic a little bit more. So just some background about the research. This developed out of the connections made between the Ngāi Tahu Research Center and the Southwest Center for the Study of Ethnic Minorities at Yunnan University in Kunming, Yunnan. And we'll come back to it, but you can see Yunnan is down there in the southwestern corner, and you can see Kunming there. So I think it was John Reed, who's with us now, who first developed this relationship with the PhD student. I don't know if he reached out to you or what it was. Yeah. So this PhD student, his name is Zhang Jianfeng, and he was, I think, anthropology? Is that what the background was for his? Yeah, in the anthropology department at Yunnan University. Reached out to John, my colleague here at the NTRC, because he was doing his thesis and looking at Ngāi Tahu. And he's definitely the first student, I don't know if it's all of them in China, but I know at least in Yunnan, that has done just finished his PhD. He actually submitted it earlier this year. And looking at Ngāi Tahu. So this is where this connection developed. And since that first connection, we've hosted our Chinese friends, I think 3 times, with Jianfeng visiting twice. We had a sort of official delegation come from the university with, I think 4 professors came last year. I think it was last March. And then we signed a memorandum of understanding that laid the basis for staff and student exchanges. So that's sort of some of the background of how we got around to doing this. So I was the first staff member to participate in the staff exchange and in any exchange. And so I traveled to Kunming in July of this year. And I spent about 3 weeks there. And I was hosted by Yunnan University in Kunming. And I basically taught this sort of crash course in Maori-Crown relations to these postgraduate students. Mainly in this anthropology and ethnography was their sort of background. I'm a historian. I teach law course, we teach Māori studies, I teach a whole bunch of different things. But they were mainly anthropologists and ethnographers. And so this research developed out of some of my time there. So China is often viewed as somewhat of a cultural monolith, like the idea of being Chinese is a straightforward and uncomplicated issue. But China is in fact a multicultural and multi-ethnic country, and if not multinational, according to some minority groups. And according to the Chinese state itself, it uses that terminology of multinationalism. Now, just like the evolution and creation of the New Zealand state, the evolution and creation of the Chinese state is a product of its history, its marriages, its wars, its land acquisitions, its various declarations of sovereignty and governance that have waxed and waned over the years. And so most of my talk today, about 3/4, will be solely about China, so laying out some of the framework there. I'm going to quickly address some of the demographic figures and government institutions that deal with ethnic minorities. I'm going to really briefly go over some of the history of ethnic minority policy. And then I'll turn to the policy development and current debates that are ensuing in China about relations between the Chinese Communist Party, which I'll just refer to as the CCP from now on, and ethnic minorities. Throughout the talk, I'll mention certain parallels with Maori-Crown relations here, and then at the end, I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. And then I'm just open for any thoughts and kind of questions that anybody has at the end. So according to the 2011 census, the dominant Han ethnic group makes up 91.5% of China. And so that's 1.23 billion people. Now, ethnic minorities are comparatively small as part of the population at only 8.5%. But in China, that still represents 114 million people. So it's still a very large group of people, even though as a percentage it might be small. Now, although China's ethnic minorities make up the small percentage, they live on over 60% of the Chinese landmass, especially in the western regions, which are also the most resource rich. So you can see here to the west, you got Tibet in the furthest west, and to the north Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia is in the yellow mainly, and you can see Yunnan, that was before on the map, is down here. And so this is just a map, as you can see, of the different ethnic groups. Now, the fact that the west coast there is so resource rich is one reason that the Chinese state in no way is ever allowing any kind of secession or independence. It's always ideas of autonomy within the Chinese state. Now, under the CCP, there are 56 ethnic nationalities, or Minzu. So I'm just going to try and use that term Minzu. If you hear that, I'm just meaning ethnic minorities. It's basically a term for that. And one of which is the majority Han ethnic group. So you've got 55 minorities and Han as the 56th nationality. Once again, you can see they're using this term nationalities, which you might seem in a Western context, you're almost like feeding the kind of fire of independence movements by saying nationality, but it's something that's still very much accepted within the parlance. Now, later on in this talk, I'll talk about how these 55 ethnic minorities came to be. There are certainly more than 55 ethnic minorities in China, but these are the 55 that have been recognized by the government. The most populous group is the Zhuang nationality, with more than 17 million people, and they're located down mainly around this area in the Guizhou province, and that's just to the east of Yunnan province where I was. The smallest is the Loba nationality, only numbering about 3,000 members, and they're located in the south of Tibet. The most famous are perhaps the Tibetans at about 5.5 million, Mongols at 5.8 million, and Uyghurs at 8.4 million. And you can see ethnic minorities are located most predominantly in the west, but they also live in many different areas of the sort of central regions here. Yunnan is probably the most ethnically diverse Chinese province, at least in relation to how many different ethnic minorities live there. they've got 24 different ethnic minorities just in the Yunnan province. And many ethnic minorities live in many different provinces. So it's not like you've just got one group in one area. The Hui, who are Muslims, are located I think in 7 different provinces or something like that. And it just shows the complicated history of China. The Hui are descendants of basically northwestern Chinese who came through with Kublai Khan and the Mongols back in the 1200s and 1300s. And when he left Muslim soldiers there to police his new imperial acquisitions, this was this Hui group. And so they're located all through central China, but they're the biggest group in Yunnan. They have over 1 million people in Yunnan and in Kunming as well. And you could see the prevalence of mosques all around the place in that way. So today in China, ethnic minorities who live in an area in which they are demographically dominant enjoy a limited degree of autonomy. So this was laid down in Article 3 of the 1954 Constitution of the People's Republic of China, which declared that China was a, quote, unitary multinational state. So this is their own sort of terminology. Article 3 protects languages and customs and allowed for what was referred to as regional autonomy. And while this might seem like a measure of rangatiratanga, or kind of self-determination in a New Zealand sense, it's in no way true autonomy. And once again, any attempts to secede are completely ruled out. Now there are 5 autonomous regions, and these are kind of provincial level. And you can see them here in the slightly darker orange. Guangxi, which is the Zhuang nationality that I talked about, the most numerous. Then you've got Tibet, Xinjiang with a Uyghur majority, Inner Mongolia with Mongolian, and Ningxia here as well, which I believe is a Hui majority. It's once again this group of Hui, of Muslims. The Uyghurs are also Muslims in Xinjiang. So you've got these 5 autonomous regions. And you've also got 30 autonomous prefectures, that's like a kind of local government level, 124 autonomous counties, and 1,200 autonomous townships. So these are within the regular provinces, I guess you would say, which are just in the kind of lighter yellow. So despite this kind of level of autonomy, according to the CCP itself, of the 80 million people living in China who live below the poverty line, about 62 million of these are ethnic minorities. So about half of all ethnic minorities live below the poverty line. So despite these sort of autonomous regions, we can still see there's serious socioeconomic disparities between the Han majority and the ethnic minority in a very general sense. So now I'm just going to turn to some of the government organization and the way it deals with this, because this is something that I felt was very confusing for any country, and certainly with a country with as large of a bureaucracy as China. So the Chinese government, the CCP, controls policy on ethnic affairs centrally from Beijing. Now, the CCP controls the government, and it's one-party rule. But a different leader is chosen every 5 years, but generally it's for 2 terms totaling 10 years. This is the party's general secretary. So you can see the bottom right corner, you've got the hierarchy of the Communist Party. And in this, you can see at the very top is the party general secretary. He's the president and the leader. Right now it's Xi Jinping, and it's quite powerful. He leads the Politburo Standing Committee, which you can see in the triangle just below it. There's 7 members there. And those 7 members, they're the 7 most powerful kind of political figures in China. And then out of those, you've got the regular Politburo, which is 25 members. Then below them, you have the Central Committee of the Communist Party, which is 376 members, and 205 of them are full members. Now, you also have the National People's Congress, which is like the parliament in a sense. But despite the fact that in theory, under the state constitution, the parliament and the People's Congress is the supreme power, as you can see in that top left table, this is more so the real structure where the Communist Party is at the head. And the control is there, especially through their party and state central military commissions. And the National People's Congress is really just a rubber stamp parliament in many ways, and it just approves of the policies that come from the top. Now, China's policy on ethnic minorities is informed by the state constitution, which has protections for ethnic minorities and their languages and their cultures and customs. And there's also, in 1984, there was a law on regional autonomy, which sort of expanded on what came out of the Constitution. But in a real practical, everyday manner, the policy is run through the Chinese Communist Party. And there are a few different departments that run this. So you've got the CCP's Central Propaganda Department, something called the United Front Department, and a state council. Now, the United Front Department is basically a department which leads relations with the non-communist parts of China. So in this case, it's a lot to do with ethnic minority leadership who aren't members of the Communist Party. And so that's where this United Front Department comes in. And you can see it's within this central committee here, has this thing called the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And then within that, you have this United Front Department. So you can see it's sort of run from the kind of fourth layer of the party leadership. But the head of this conference is still a part of this Politburo Standing Committee. So this group of 7 members that are very powerful. Now you also have the State Council, which you can see up here on the right. And the State Council is basically the government ministers, their officials, and the administrators. Right? So like a crown official and the crown ministers, they work within the State Council. And you can see these two kind of have an overlap. So there's people within this Politburo Standing Committee that lead the State Council. But within the State Council as well, you have something called the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, which you can see at the bottom of the pyramid there. So these groups work in concert to basically develop this policy on ethnic minorities. And you've got certain leaders within the Communist Party who take the lead basically on ethnic affairs. Now, despite the fact that you have these autonomous areas, they always have to take everything that's decreed from Beijing at a very high level. So there's this autonomy in theory, but it's certainly highly centrally controlled. I hope that's somewhat clear. It just shows you how it is centralized, but there's also a lot of different departments that are involved in it as well. And I guess it just shows you the complexity of the ethnic minority policy and the complexity of ever trying to reform any kind of policies within this system. It's very slow. It certainly moves very slowly. Okay, so I just wanted to take you quickly, very quickly, just through some of the history that feeds into the ethnic minority policy. I mean, what this is basically trying to show you is that Chinese history is very long. China is one of the areas that has been, inhabited for some of the longest periods of time, one of the first places with forms of writing. So the written history is incredibly long. In any way that you contrast it with New Zealand, with both Maori and Pākehā arriving here, and in relatively recent terms in contrast to the settlement of China as we know it today. Now, these first iterations of what is traditionally viewed as China, it's always focused on the Han, right? It's only on the Han state in general that the focus is on, and it's really the ethnic minorities and the ways that they interact with the Han state is where they come into the picture. This obviously varies. In this Yunnan province where I was down here, there used to be a kingdom called the Dali Kingdom, which was in the 1200s, and this was seen as a state of its own, certainly. So it's not the only, it's not only Han-centered, but generally that's how it kind of goes. Now the issue there is that, the term for China in Mandarin is Zhongguo, which means Middle Kingdom. And that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of nationalist mindset, right? That Han China is the center of the earth. This is something shared by many different cultures. Tamati tells me that Tuahiwi is the center of the earth sometimes. Everybody has their own thing where they view their communities, as the center of it. But I think some of this Han nationalism and ideas about civilization and barbarism is very much tied up in a classic Victorian European imperial mindset that we would recognize. Civilization means you're settled agriculture, and barbarism means you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer. And so there certainly has been those kinds of dichotomies, which we will recognize very much here. And that's really important because the idea of China as a multinational, unitary multinational country is tied up in the idea of one China, right? It's multinational, but it's focused on this idea of one China. So if we look through, you have the Qin dynasty in 221 BC is probably your first idea of a unified China, is when the 6 kingdoms were brought together. And you basically have a consolidation and a solidification of kind of Chinese interests in these areas over the years. In imperial China, this was really important as well. You were generally fighting with the so-called barbarians to the west, and sometimes they were brought into these empires, sometimes they kept apart. This Dali kingdom is certainly one example of that I just said in the Yunnan province. But what was important is that imperial China was a really heterogeneous and really diverse, right? It basically lays the basis for the Chinese state as we know it today. Some Chinese leaders, some emperors, were more comfortable on a horse than on a throne. The Tang dynasty there at 3.7, the founder was of multi-ethnic origins. One of the most famous mariners was Zheng He, who was a Muslim who was sent off basically and went as far as Africa on sailing missions. The Manchu, who are an ethnic minority, basically ran the Qing Empire, the last imperial dynasty. And so they're viewed as an ethnic minority today. And so obviously this Manchu conquest of China made really important contributions, because China wouldn't be the size it is today without this Manchu invasion of all of China. So moving on into the kind of modern era, as I said, in imperial China there was a recognition of all these different ethnicities. In the Republican era, the first Chinese leader was Sun Yat-sen, and he recognized the existence of only 4 ethnic minorities: Manchus, Mongolians, Tibetans, and Huis. Now, the leader, his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, believed in only one. He said all Chinese were the same. We're just variations through geography, but we're all just one ethnic group. Neither of these really made much difference. From 1911 to 1949, China as a state certainly wasn't able to be run as it is today. Basically, the Republicans were always dealing with either regional warlords, the Chinese Communist Party or Japanese invasion. So there was no real time, even though they had these policies, they didn't have any effect because they couldn't reach that far. And so it's really when the Chinese Communist Party comes to power in 1949 that things change. Now, initially, relations with ethnic minorities were given special status. And the Chinese Communist Party sent out teams of anthropologists to classify and categorize these non-Han groups. And many of these were in the west of the country, as you saw on that map before. Now, these anthropologists and ethnographers ultimately created these 55 Minzu, or ethnic minority groups, even though 400 separate ethnicities were reported in the first census, which was undertaken by the CCP in 1953 to 1954. So you can see that this process of ethnic kind of classification was a really political process. So you have this ethnic classification project which produced these 55 groups, and it's very much a product of history and political control. So the CCP had won the war with the nationalists, with the Kuomintang. They had a civil war from 45 to 49. And they had generally won the war because of their positive relationships with groups in the West. Mao's long march in the 1930s, where they gradually came to the East Coast, comes through many Western areas, but right through Yunnan and right through Kunming. So they basically, promise a utopia to these groups, saying that we'll be, far greater than the nationalists. So they kind of need to keep them on board, and that's where you can see this idea of this multinational state. Nonetheless, just like the Kuomintang, the CCP is really focused on this idea of one China. It's just through different ways. It's seen as sort of one big family, right? China is one big family, and every one of the ethnic minorities has a role to play in this. So you see 56 nationalities doll sets. You've got 56 exhibits in national museums. You have 56 children in costumes at the Beijing Olympics openings. You've got these 56 requisite brief histories for all these different groups. And you can kind of see the similarities there with the categorization of Maori, Iwi, and Hapu by the Crown. Since the treaty, there's very much parallels, I think, there. And I'll explore this a little more towards the end of the talk today. But what's important here is to view this ethnic minorities in China as a narrative in nation building rather than a recognition of autonomy. So this ethnic classification project dwindles these groups down, and basically it's not even run by the Chinese Communist Party. It's actually run by anthropologists and ethnographers themselves. And they're actually influenced by a British military officer who's there in the early 1900s. So it's kind of strange is that it serves the Chinese Communist Party, but the ideology was not Communist Party influence for deciding who makes it into these 55 Minzu. And this was really tough because if your ethnic group didn't make it in, not only would you have to, get used to being a part of the Chinese state, but you also had to subsume yourself into your neighbor's, the ethnic group that was given some special status. So there was a two-pronged challenge for these groups. And basically, without state recognition, many of these groups struggle to maintain their languages and their cultural traditions. So you have this ethnic classification project, and in the early 1950s, there's generally a sense of kind of ethnic pluralism, like there's a recognition of these ethnic minorities in the early years of CCP rule. This came to a close in 1957, 1958. You have the first mass collectivizations of farms all around China. It was called the anti-rightist campaign, and this affected large groups of Han, but also Uyghurs, Koreans, Mongols. And so at this time, China really goes strongly with the one China rhetoric and tries to get groups to abandon their customs and traditions, to learn the Chinese language, and to wear these sort of Mao-style suits. This continues right on, as you can imagine, through the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Intense, harsh class struggle pursued on a daily basis. There is no room for ethnic minorities or being different in any way. And this policy of forced assimilation gave rise to ethnic tensions, conflicts, and violence. Now, when Deng Xiaoping came to power in the late 1970s after Mao died, Chinese government began to repudiate these policies. And so we've got a sort of return to the early 1950s when it seemed like there was a sort of acceptance of ethnic minorities within the Chinese state. And this has continued on through to the present day. Now, these autonomous regions that I discussed before, that you can see up here, they're basically given some control over finances. You know, they can get control over tax money coming in, and it's certainly a higher level of control than provinces get, right? And the central government also provides some decent financial help as well. Some other aspects of these autonomous regions, you can also have support for your language. Some of the court systems are run on a bilingual basis, so you can, you know, take your case to court and the decisions are written out. So while there's this one level where it seems like there is some autonomy taking place, it's really the control of the Central Communist Party bureaucracy. That's where the true influence is, right? So it's kind of like these ethnic minority groups get administrative control, but not executive control. So they can sort of fill out the sheets, but not create the sheets. And so if we come back to this here, the National People's Congress, which was like the parliament, but once again was sort of rubber stamp. It had, of 161 members, 25 were ethnic minorities, which was 15.5%. So that's actually double the actual demographic as a part of the percentage of the country. Once again, that's the rubber stamp though. The Standing Committee of the Politburo, right? That's those 7 members that are the most powerful people in the country. None of them are ethnic minorities. And none of that 25-member Politburo below it as well. So you can see at the very highest levels of power, there are no ethnic minorities. The head of all of these regions here, right, these autonomous regions, the party secretary is the ultimate head there and is never an ethnic minority. It's always somebody Han. The person just below him could be an ethnic minority and has been in many cases, but you can see how the top leadership is pretty much all Han still. So at a very, you know, in a system where it's centrally controlled, these top positions are really important, and that's where you can see there's still a gap. So one of the most challenging aspects to this ethnic minority policy has been some of the violent reactions by ethnic minorities in Tibet and Xinjiang regions to the CCP control and especially Han settlement in the areas. And in 2008, riots broke out in the capital of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in Urumqi. So that's right there, you can see in the top left, and Urumqi is the capital. And basically there were some peaceful protests that really descended into violence. You had Uyghur vigilantes hunting down and basically killing Han civilians or those they perceived as Han, because once again it's just like looking at somebody's face isn't sometimes always the best way to determine what that person's background is. And there was the same thing in another way. There was Han vigilantes going around, and there was a huge military crackdown. Thousands of Uyghurs were imprisoned. Outside world, communication with the outside world was cut off. No phone, no internet. And so this has been the challenge that has faced the CCP. And it's actually been one of the biggest challenges for the state in the last 10 years or so. And you can see this is some of the footage of the military that's called in to deal with this. So with these problems, it's sort of the one thing that nearly everybody in China can agree on, is something is not right. So you've got Ai Weiwei, who's this very amazing artist, progressive artist, Chinese artist, who says these policies have failed. On the other side, you have these ultra-nationalists, sort of Mike Hosking on steroids, and he also thinks it's failed. So you can see both sides, the sort of progressive and very nationalist sides, are all saying there's something that kind of needs to change. So what do we have going forward? The top levels of the CCP leadership say nothing needs to change, everything is fine, we'll just keep going that way. Now, how do we reform this? Now, the main criticism from the dominant Han Chinese is some of the preferential policies that ethnic minorities get. So we've seen these regional autonomous regions, and these are coupled with these special preferences. These dealt with during the one-child policy. Ethnic minorities could have more than one child. There's extra points on the state exams, so education privileges as well. There's also preferential access for employment and huge state subsidies. And so, you know, stop me if you think this heard this one. A demographically and politically and economically dominant group that controls everything in a nation state still has complaints about what's being done to perhaps help ethnic minorities breach this, this gap. So this is something that, you know, I recognized it just sounded exactly like you were in New Zealand or somewhere else, where you could see articles in the newspaper complaining about these special privileges and that they needed to stop. Even one of the students, one of these grad students, when I was taking them through, you know, I taught them about the Maori seats in Parliament, and he was like, "Isn't that discriminatory? Why do they have these special seats?" And so you could tell it's really similar kind of narratives, even though the settings are very different. So one of the big challenges here is, how do you deal with this? I mean, yes, there are these special privileges that are laid out to try and breach this gap, but there's also huge Han control of all of these places still. Like I said, Han, you know, bureaucrats and politicians are the heads of these autonomous regions. Han businesses also are often in these areas. Even in where I was in the Yunnan province, I went to this place, Lijiang, which is sort of up here. And the guy running the hotel was from the Shaanxi province, which is up in the north. But he was basically Han. And he's just what I was told was a classic example of you have Han businessmen coming to these areas. So even though there's a whole bunch of investment going in there, the perception from the view of ethnic minorities is that all that money is just going to Han businessmen that are coming there. So it's like sending money to a region and saying we're helping you, and still, you know, controlling it in a similar way. So that is one big criticism there. It's also the same with languages. Only the languages that are recognized by the Chinese Communist Party get support. If your language doesn't have party support, then you won't get the funding for it. So there's definitely still limits there. So I just want to turn, just for the last few minutes here, just to talk a little bit about the challenges of teaching this sort of Maori-Crown relations in China. Most students had no knowledge of New Zealand's history and had a vague knowledge of even the existence of Maori. This probably wouldn't be too surprising. I'm sure if you ask most New Zealanders, they'd have little idea about the multi-ethnic nature of China. But one of the greatest challenges was the idea of the treaty. The treaty as this establishment of sovereignty here in New Zealand, and the differences between the different translations and governance and what all this means. The students understood quite well the wars and confiscations in the North in the 1860s. That was far more clear to them. But the notion of a treaty, I think, is much more of a foreign policy view from these Chinese students. They knew about the Hong Kong Treaty and the treaties that came out of the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion and all these things that had happened. So it was just a different frame of mind. They would kind of ask, they're like, why did they sign this treaty? Because in the Chinese conception, well, at least from these students, when Han groups invaded an area, they would put down their settlers into that area. There wasn't this idea of a treaty. One example was this ethnic group called the Miao, who had a series of rebellions in the 1800s. And so this is something they kept on bringing up because it was kind of in a similar time frame. And so there was a bit of a disconnect in trying to get that through. But they certainly got the idea of the treaty. They know that it's an agreement. But they were just surprised that it would form the basis for basically nation building. Now, what I tried to make clear to them that the treaty is not respected and that you had war and you had the native land court, you had all these administrative means that were used to take lands that, didn't even use the sword. They just stuck with the pen, really, in so many cases. So some of those comparisons were a bit difficult. My focus is on treaty settlements. That's my expertise. There is no parallel for this in China. You do have money, as I said, flowing to these autonomous regions. Sometimes a lot of money has been invested, certainly in the past 15, 20 years, to try and bridge this gap. But who's controlling it? More money is flowing into these ethnic minority areas than is flowing through treaty settlements, I can tell you that much. But at least these treaty settlements are controlled, by these post-settlement governance entities, and we've got huge problems with the way we deal with treaty settlements in New Zealand, but at least some sense of that community is controlling those assets. Even if it's pennies on the dollar, there is actual control there. And that's something that might kind of contrast with what's happening in China. When I think of these autonomous regions, I think of the Tuhoi settlement and the recent Whanganui River settlement, where we had some, especially in Te Urewera, where you have, in theory, Tuhoi control. Whether that's going to be real, we'll see. But that was another comparison to these autonomous regions. Once again, is it administrative or executive control? We'll see if that's the case in Te Urewera in the future, and with the Whanganui River as well. But that was another area where I thought there was at least some scope for comparison. And then coming back to this ethnic classification project, it has such parallels with the way that iwi and hapu have been categorized. I mean, in the 1860s, the government was focused on individualizing interests, right? It was focused on having rangatira sell their lands, and then it was focused on the native land court and splitting up the tribal estate. And then in the 20th century, we had this re-tribalization in a way, trust board settlements, modern treaty settlements, but I think you can definitely see parallels there. I think there are very strong parallels in the way that the government chooses who it's negotiating with and how it categorizes people. And that's usually done to support the state. And so I think there the similarities are actually really quite stark. So, the situation in these two countries are vastly different in many ways. Violent confrontation has not taken place for 100 years in New Zealand, dating back to the 1916 invasion of Maunga Pohatu, actually 100 years ago this year. That is very different from what has been happening in Xinjiang province, not to mention the self-immolations in Tibet. But the colonization of both groups of people, I think, is worthy of some comparison. The settings have been different, but there are shared experiences and processes that took place. Groups in both countries are fighting to achieve some form of autonomy, to maintain their cultures and their languages in the face of the hegemony of the modern nation state. Kia ora.